exact definition would be the court must have the government must have a compelling purpose for considering race, and that its use of race must be very narrowly tailored to fit this function. And so that's kind of the precedent that was set with Bakken. And then and the other thing that I was looking at was with Fisher, the implications of this reverse discrimination case, which just based on the facts of the way the admissions policy works, there wasn't very much standing for the use of race as a form of discrimination. And the fact that this case is able to make it all the way to the Supreme Court with very little backing is very frightening, and just kind of sets a dangerous precedent for the ability for reverse discrimination cases to be defended, and the rights of, I guess, of white people to be so adamantly defended in court. And as part of that, even though Kennedy cited in favor of the University of Texas, saying that they were not, they did not violate the Equal Protection Clause, this is the very first time that Justice Kennedy, a conservative judge, found that any admissions policy was adequate in a sense to protect the rights of all individuals.
So I know in the Bakken case, Justice Powell, who wrote the plurality opinion, talked about when you were talking about that narrowly tailored state interest, and that has typically played out in terms of like diversity gains, but not necessarily redressing, ages and decades of discrimination. How does that change the ways that colleges have to approach policies?
So if you just kind of look at the history of affirmative action cases, you see very slowly this kind of dismantling of what colleges are allowed to do in pursuit of diversity. And you see, like the Bakken is the very first example, and said, okay, that race is something that can be considered in admissions, but quotas, which was the method used by UC Davis, is unconstitutional. And so you see kind of very slowly each case kind of eating away at this this whole pursuit of diversity. And that's kind of the theme that I found, was this idea of this Trojan horse of on the upfront we have these plaintiffs saying that they're being wronged, and so you have these people in the background, just Ed Bloom, other Heritage Foundation, and other movements really pushing this narrative of affirmative action harming all people and attacking all individuals of society through these cases, and slowly eating away at the policy. And you finally get to Fisher, where there's very little to any use of race in admissions, and it's against the Supreme Court. So it's kind of the implication of this subversive policy underneath, kind of not really being brought up in these cases, because you're really focusing on the plaintiff and how they're wrong. And you kind of start to feel for like, oh, that's so awful. And you can't, it really sucks that they kind of were wrong in this way, without looking at the actual implications of what each case kind of tears down in the policy.
What are the main arguments that are playing out in the lawsuit since it first came out, and how much more what's coming out there?
So a lot of the disagreement right now is on, I guess it's statistics of the matter. So maybe if you want to talk to me,
Sure, yeah. So there are sort of two different sides of this. There's the legal argument, which are presented in the legal and amici briefs, and then there are the expert reports that are written by two experts for each side. So I mostly looked into the questions entertained by the experts. So the expert for SFFA had answered three main questions. The first question is there statistical evidence that race and ethnicity plays how large of a role does race and ethnicity play in college admissions? And the second question is, how do these compare across races and ethnicities that colleges consider? And the third question is, does Harvard admissions have a specific floor or ceiling for Asian American applicants for their admissions rates? I thought the third question was particularly interesting because, as Marco mentioned earlier, quotas specifically are illegal and unconstitutional. Harvard might be playing within a range, also just opens up a whole new set of questions. Is a quota a specific, like a hard, say, 14%, the same as year after year repeating a range of percentage between, say, like 13 and 17%? Can you equate those? Is one more legally acceptable than the other? So those were the three questions that SFFA's expert had to answer. So to address the first question, the SFFA expert kind of runs through a bunch of graphs and statistics about GPAs and SAT scores and all these academic indicators. What was found in that is that Asian Americans on objective academic categories tend to outperform other racial and ethnic groups. But then the next thing that was examined is the personal rating score, which Sam talks about more in her research, that it seems to be flipped, where that is the category where Asian Americans are ranked lowest. But the question is by how much, and do those really balance out? So after a lot of pages of reading, the expert then concludes that this difference in the personal rating and how that changes between races and ethnicities is statistically significant. So basically, the expert came up with this algorithm that say you control for everything else. You control for academics, athletics, and any other factors considered in the holistic review of college admissions, and you change race. So he took a typical Asian American male and kept all those stats the same and then changed it to an African American male. He said that the chances of admission for an Asian American male were 25%, but then when switched out to African American became 95%. I didn't really look into yet how exactly he got those numbers, but essentially through all of his research, he says that there is a correlation between race and chances of admission. But there's this phrase that you hear in every single intro statistics class, that correlation is not necessarily the same as causation. So just because you can show that there's a certain trend between two variables, that doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other. But that's where SFFA comes in to bring in their legal argument. They're using the correlation that the expert finds to justify that they can say that Harvard has an implicit bias against Asian Americans that plays out in admissions and specifically the personal rating. And then in terms of Harvard's side of the case, a lot of the times in civil cases where people bring in experts, the defense side will bring in an expert to refute the methods of the plaintiff or SFFA's expert, and that's exactly what Professor Card, who is Harvard's expert, did. His set of questions looked slightly different than the set of questions were presented from SFFA's side. What Professor Card had to do was say, oh, is SFFA's methods actually giving statistical evidence for what they're claiming, that Harvard is actually discriminating based on the piece of race. And what Professor Card decides to do is to say that the data itself is not necessarily comprehensive for the kind of claim that SFFA is trying to make. So simply using, this goes into a larger legal argument that you can't define an applicant based just on statistics, right? There's a holistic review. That's why you have teacher recommendations, counselor recommendations, interviews. You have multiple readers throughout the process. So what Harvard does is they connect their statistical and their legal arguments to say that the data that SFFA uses isn't enough for them to claim, first of all, that a correlation exists, and secondly, that they can legally claim there's a causation between differences in admission, specifically what they call the Asian American penalty between race and admission.
Speaking to like the logic of the arguments, so SFFA, they find that with their statistical models that Asian Americans statistically have, on average, lower personal ratings than everybody else. There are two explanations. The first possible explanation is that Asian Americans are legitimately lacking in those qualities of like humor, charisma, leadership, courage, things like that, right? Like kindness, right? Okay, so that's a racist premise, so we're not going to consider that. The second possibility is that they're not different, like on average, but they're being rated differently, and that has two possible explanations. The first explanation is Harvard is intentionally, or like deliberately, giving them lower ratings, like knowing that they are like on average same as everybody else, but on average giving them lower ratings, and that just made that Harvard guilty. But the second is that Harvard is unintentionally discriminating based on like personal biases, like unconscious biases, or like stereotypes that they're not aware of. But even this is still some form of discrimination, and they make like certain technical arguments for that. But the point is that any way you slice it, if Asian Americans are receiving lower personality ratings on average, then that's just like, that's the case in point. It's like Harvard's guilty. What's fascinating though is that Harvard's argument, on the one hand, they attack it on two fronts. The first front is to argue against statistics, deny the fact that that the Asian Americans are getting lower ratings. The second is that I guess I want to say it's justified, which is to say, so if you look at the Michi groups, right, basically friends of the court, there were two friends of the court. One was the individuals. Those were represented by, I think, 8 students of Harvard. And basically they gave like written testimonies about their views on affirmative action and such. But basically their argument was that we have to understand merit not just in this like narrow sense of ability times effort, but rather in terms of a holistic sense of like who the applicant is as a whole. We actually went to the closing arguments in Austin in February, and it was one of the exhibits they showed was like this essay, right, that one of the applicants wrote, and they blacked out all the parts that had anything to do with her race, and I would say like 70% of it was blacked out. The point being that like you really can't see the person like as they are, the applicant as they are, without considering things like the race, their socioeconomic status, etc. So such that the race conscious admissions is actually more fair. It's actually more accurate than a race blind admissions. The second argument was made by the groups which is like all these groups that was represented by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And their argument was essentially that diversity has all these benefits, not just as a social good. Again, this is like with legal precedents. It's a compelling statement that justifies race-conscious admissions, but also the fact that it promotes the educational environment of the campus. I think the fascinating thing about both of these arguments, though, is that they both have to speak to the notion of diversity. They actually can't speak to things like historical reparations that Shauna brought up, because legal precedent has argued or has ruled that historical reparations, using race-conscious admissions to make up for all the past injustices and oppression that underrepresented minorities have received, is unconstitutional. So Harvard is not allowed to bring up the argument in the court, which actually limits the arguments it can be. That being said, for the supporters, ideologically, that it should still be a factor that we should think about.
Yeah, when they first filed their lawsuit, a lot of their rhetoric was around, a lot of their arguments were around the ways that the underrepresented minorities like Black and Latinx students were taking spots from Asian American students. So the applicants better quote unquote applications. But in general, it seems that they kind of switched their argument and kind of moved away from attacking affirmative action. They actually, in Harvard Magazine, which they published an article following one of the hearings at the court, and one of the SFFA's attorney actually said, now we're arguing that Asian American students are being discriminated against over white applicants. Sorry, did I bring that right? White applicants are being admitted over Asian American students. What's your guess as to why or how that shift occurred?
Well, to put it really bluntly, and I think this is kind of paraphrasing something that Edward Bloom directly, and that more or less said, was that white plaintiffs aren't sympathetic. Using them as the front, as the person who's being hurt by admissions, generally doesn't work once you get to the Supreme Court. So he's using Asian Americans as a racial mascot, because people are just more sympathetic to white POCs and that's just something people can get behind. So if you say that a group of people of color is being affected by a policy, people are more likely to be like, oh, there's some merit there. Though it does get a little sketchy that it is a movement that's being pushed by a white man, but because it has a POC face, it's just something that's more tolerable than a white man saying, oh, here is a white girl with subpar academics who says that people of color have stolen her spot in school. I don't really know how you can possibly phrase that in a way that you have even the public side with you.
Right, but now they're arguing that like, that it's not minorities who are taking, underrepresented minorities who are taking away Asian Americans' spots, it's white applicants now. So it's a pretty significant shift, and it's really interesting. I mean, and I've, like in my personal opinion, I can't really quite understand either, except that they recognize that there was a lot of media attention, and that there were a lot of Asian American communities rallying for Harvard. What was your opinion?
So I think philosophically, it's like a change in definition of discrimination. It's no longer about not having enough seats available for Asian Americans. Rather, it's the standard to which Asian Americans are held relative to the baseline. The baseline is white. Yeah, because that's the majority. So I think though the implications of this could still arguably be targeted against affirmative action. So I think philosophically, I think that switch was made because it's more of a tenable position. It's like a more realistic definition of discrimination. I think politically it makes sense because of all the tension about like legacy admissions and like athletic admissions and that kind of stuff. And like big donors, like what was it? Varsity Blues. Yeah, good stuff. But I think this. But even with this switch, right, even if they're now changing the argument to say that Asian Americans are less likely to get into the white counterparts, they can still target affirmative action because they can say, listen, clearly Asian Americans are being disadvantaged, right? And we can't trust ourselves to use race at all. Because like, even if we try to we can't innocently try to use race for like underrepresented minorities with affirmative action while still trying to avoid discriminating against Asian Americans. Like our unconscious biases don't allow for that. Like those are too pernicious. So in order to just play it safe, it's better just to get rid of the whole thing.
I also feel like, to put it more simply, not so philosophically, I also feel like they're just trying to make it seem like if they win, white students will also be disadvantaged, but that's just not the case. Like I feel like this goes back to what I was saying about the major narrative that's following this story, just like covering a lot. Like they're basically saying that like if whites that are the performing Asians are getting ranked higher than Asian Americans, then like the same thing must be happening to a greater extent with racial minorities, but they don't mention the racial minorities part. And Eric mentioned we did go to the closing arguments. They didn't mention the phrase affirmative action once. Like they're not trying to make this. They're trying to make themselves seem like the good guys that are fighting for Asian Americans. And the sort of rhetoric that happens when they say that white students will also be disadvantaged if, like, they win. Like, that makes them seem more like the good guys.
A big component in all of this is your research topic or personal rating. How does that come up in the case, and what does the evidence come?
Yeah, so I think the reason I chose this topic was because I thought there was more need for dialogue between the people that are opposing affirmative action and the people that are supporting it. So there are a lot of angry Asian parents because their children that aren't getting into the schools have the numbers. Like, if you look at them on paper, they're like basically perfect. Like, you can't really, like, there's like nothing else they could improve on. Like, they're like excelling in all these different areas, yet they're not getting in. And a lot of that has to do with the numbers. And so I think my question is, how do we define like who deserves to get in, quote unquote, who deserves to get in a country where opportunity is like so defined by racial and socioeconomic position? And so I think that's what leads us to the holistic admissions process, because that's a process that claims that numbers aren't enough. We need to look at more, and that's where the personal rating category comes in. And for my podcast, I'm going to be looking at at how this category historically evolved, and I'm going to be arguing that it connects a lot to this idea of merit. And earlier, the reason I brought up that Edward Bloom is Jewish is because in the SFFA complaint that they submitted against Harvard, they cite Karabel multiple times. And Karabel wrote this work in which he discusses how Jewish applicants to Harvard were discriminated against in the 1920s. So in the 1920s, there was an actual quota for the number of Jewish students that could be accepted into Harvard. And Harvard did this discrimination extremely explicitly, which they don't do anymore because it's like not legal. But back then they had a committee that was literally tasked with ranking applicants on these categories like J1, J2, J3, and other, based on who seemed most Jewish, so that they could literally control for these numbers of students, because they didn't want the majority WASP population of their student body to get outnumbered by Jewish students. So SFFA cites that a lot because what happened historically is that Harvard came up with character as a way to keep these Jewish students out. So they used like personal character and things like character and personality in order to keep Jewish students out. And so that relates to this lawsuit because people are claiming that Asians are the new Jews. Like that's the same way that we're being discriminated against in this trial. And Karabel himself actually released an op-ed saying Asians are not the new Jews, except like his work is so seminal that like he is cited so many times in SFFA's claims, and like it makes it seem like there is a direct correlation between what happened in the 1920s and what's happening now. And so I think that's what my podcast will sort of try to debunk. So how personal rating is used now is applications to Harvard are ranked through like 1 through 4, 1 being the highest, on 4 different categories: academic, extracurricular, athletic, and personal. And so what happens is, because Harvard is so competitive, it doesn't really matter if you get a 1 or 2 in the academic aspect of it, because there are so many other people who have the numbers, and that's why the personal rating category is such a significant aspect of this. And I will also be doing like interviews. I started some, but like there's just a lot of opacity in how personality is used. Like one of my interviewees was like, I asked her how she thinks personality factors into college admissions, and she was like, well, does it have to do with race? But like Harvard really like explicitly says that race cannot be considered the personal ratings category anymore after the lawsuit. So what happened was this like personal rating category originally for the class of 2018, they released like reading guidelines that they give to all their admissions officers. And back then, for the class of 2018, it was like one-word things. Like you would rank someone's personal rating of 5 if they were outstanding. Like what does that mean? Like I don't know, and like I don't think the admissions officers know either. You just like the concept of like quantifying someone's personal character and their like personality is just something that's very opaque in general. And so for the class of 2023, Harvard released like way more guidelines regarding what like actually consists of like a ranking 5 personal rating versus a ranking 3 personal rating. And so there's a lot more direction, but still I think the main point of my podcast is that there needs to be more opacity in how personality is used in college admissions in general, and sort of more public awareness that there is this like randomness when it comes to college admissions, and you can't say that just because you get rejected from the Ivy Leagues, like you suffered racial discrimination. Like that might not be the case. And like everyone always said that like getting accepted to Ivy Leagues is like a lottery process, and like doing more research, it literally is kind of like that. Like it's so dependent on everything, like on who's reading your application, on like what you're writing your essay about. Like I think that's the thing that these Asian American opponents of affirmative action just are not understanding, and I think that's going to be my focus on for my podcast.
Yeah, it is interesting when you raise the question that, or the point that Edward Bloom is Jewish. DJ, I know your project with you looking into studying his background. What prompted his interest in affirmative action?
program, and while he was there, I think it was a congressional race. He saw that a Democratic candidate was running unopposed, and he decided to run as the Republican candidate. And that's not super surprising because he did get involved with conservative groups while he was living in Houston. But while he was going door to door campaigning, he thought that he saw issues with the way that the districts were being lined up in Houston. He thought that there was gerrymandering going on in Tyson. So he took his first official case to the Supreme Court because I don't believe he's not a lawyer. That's been said a couple of times. He's a litigator. He actually has absolutely no formal law training in any way, shape, or form. Essentially, his job is to take plaintiffs and send them to attorneys who are interested in taking up their cases sending it to the Supreme Court. That's really his only role. He calls himself a matchmaker of sorts. So that was his first big case, kind of taking the gerrymandering there, taking Supreme Court, and they actually did rule in his favor. And I think that's the first time he really got involved with anything race-based, and from that point on, it just kind of grew from there, because he really does employ frames that look at society through colorblind lenses. He just is really adamant that any race-based policies in the United States should be abolished. He doesn't want to see any way, shape, or form. He thought that the gerrymandering that was happening was benefiting voters of color. So that was an unfair advantage that they were having. So he said, do away with it, and they did give him that. So I think that it did start off with education, but it did start with race and just continues to be race. And I can't quite understand why that's a particular thing for him, but that's what he's really latched on to, and he's just really trying to walk through it in different sectors.
And he's behind, he's the face of SFFA?
He is SFFA. It has no office. The organization's phone number is his personal cell phone number. It's only him. There's no one else. Every year they give out an annual report. It's signed by him and only him. He's very much a one-man organization, and that's not to say that he's completely devoid of having money, because the money that's used to pay the attorneys that are currently taking up Bishop cases that are taking up the Harvard cases come out of a legal defense fund that has donations from conservative organizations, such as one called Donors Fund and another one called Cyril something. But they're just, he does have conservative backing, but generally he does project himself as a meek, soft-spoken man of the people who only wants what's best for society. He thinks that's best done with race not being a factor in any way, shape, or form of how government runs. So that's what he's up to.
Yeah, it's interesting though that